I'm Adrian Finnegan in Ukraine's capital, Kiev. Ukraine's fertile soil has turned it into a major breadbasket of the world, but the war has made it tough for farmers to harvest and export their crop.
And I'm Darine Abougeda in Doha. Disruptions in Ukrainian supply has pushed up global food prices to record highs. You're watching our special week-long coverage on Al Jazeera of the Ukraine war 1 year on.
I'm John Hendren in Kansas, where farmers are planting more wheat in part due to the war in Ukraine. I'll explain why coming up.
This highly fertile black soil under the snow is known in Ukraine as Chernozem. Before the war, 32 million hectares of land were cultivated every year, an area larger than Italy. Now, Ukraine and Russia together produce 30% of the world's wheat exports, and Ukraine itself exported about half of the world's sunflower oil. The disruption caused by the war and rising energy prices sent food and fertilizer prices soaring to record highs in 2022. From Peru to Sri Lanka, the developing world was the hardest hit, and protests followed around the world. The UN said at the end of 2022 that a record 349 million people across 79 countries are facing acute food insecurity. Now, a grain export deal brokered by the UN and Turkey has enabled a partial recovery in shipments from Ukraine. Wheat prices are now at pre-war levels, but it's unclear whether Moscow will sign off on a new agreement when the current deal expires in March.
The war has devastated agriculture in frontline areas of Ukraine. Many farmers believe that Russian forces deliberately set out to destroy their livelihoods. Natasha Butler has more now from Lukashivka in northern Ukraine.
Grigory has owned this farm in northern Ukraine for decades, but he still can't believe what happened to it last year. Russian soldiers occupied the property for 3 weeks in March. They destroyed buildings, ransacked produce and killed more than 150 cows. Pointless destruction that Grigory believes was driven by envy.
They were killing everything because we live better than them. We have farms, good jobs, roads, streetlights. They painted on our walls. Who let you live better than us? I think they saw a civilized and developing country and wanted to get it because without it they have no future.
Grigory and his family fled the farm just before it was taken over. He tells us that Russian soldiers killed some people who stayed in the village. Now he's trying to rebuild his life and his business and fix what the Russians destroyed.
This whole area had to be demined after the Russians left, and these are just some of the many rockets that were fired at the farm.
The farm's CCTV cameras captured the repeated attacks. At the top of some of the pictures, terrified cows can be seen trying to run away.
I really hope the rest of Europe never experiences this. I'm grateful for the military and humanitarian support we're getting, but if it stops coming, Ukraine won't be able to keep fighting this monster, and the aggressors will move on to other European countries.
Agriculture is one of Ukraine's biggest industries, but it's being battered by the war. Many farms have been destroyed, so getting ones like this running again is key to the war effort. Grigory says he's doing everything he can to help. He even has a son and son-in-law fighting with Ukrainian forces on the front lines. Just one Ukrainian family's way of defying the senseless cruelty that their country is enduring. Natasha Butler, Al Jazeera, Lukashivka, northern Ukraine.
Let's head to a food market here in Kiev. My colleague Zain Basravi is there. Zain, just how significant is the damage to Ukraine's farming infrastructure?
Well, Adrian, let me just tell you, we're here in the heart of the old city at this farmers market, a Soviet-era construction. And the people here are the kinds of people that are, in a way, doubly affected by this war. Everyone in Ukraine is affected by the war, but farming, those in the farming community, those associated to the agricultural industry, to food production, are doubly affected because these are some of the main economic activities in this country. It's one of the main industries for Ukraine. And just to give you a sense of how significant that is for the global market, Ukraine is one of the top 10 grain-producing countries in the world. We're talking about wheat and maize and barley and sunflower products, cooking oil, corn oil. So when the Russians invaded and started to take over territory, it became a major problem for a country that has been nicknamed the breadbasket of Europe. Now, Ukraine is a large country, farms are still functioning, but if you go down to the local level, if you go down to places like the Kiev region, farms around this area, Chernihiv, Zaporizhia region, and even Kherson region, a place that was under Russian occupation, that was just today a target for 35 Grad rockets in and around that city. These are agrarian communities. These are communities where farming plays a central role, and they are indeed struggling because even if the Russians aren't bombarding their farms, even if they've left, many of these farms are filled with landmines and unexploded ammunitions. We've heard of stories about farm animals, cows, wandering into fields and setting off landmines. People have also been injured and killed when tractors have driven over landmines in farming fields. So this is a serious problem. And it is one that the UN says, demining these agricultural areas, this could take years.
Zain, how much is Ukraine able to export right now?
Well, that deal you heard about earlier in our reporting has gone a long way to resolving a lot of the issues, but pre-war numbers are that Ukraine pulled $27 billion a year, 41% of all of its exports were agricultural. And it hasn't reached those pre-war levels yet, but last year it did manage through that deal to export 33 million tons of grain as part of the food deal to help to curb the global food crisis that has been sparked by this war. But that deal sets to expire next month, and whether or not it'll be renewed in the current political situation is something of a real concern to leaders here in Kiev.
Zain, many thanks indeed. Zain Basravi there live at a food market here in Kiev. Joining me now is Yuri Vaskov, who is the Deputy Minister of Infrastructure here in Ukraine. Yuri, good to have you with us. We heard Zain there talking about the grain deal and the fact that the shipments have slowed down. What is taking so long? Why is it so difficult to get these vessels in and out of that inspection zone right now?
First of all, I would like to remind that Ukraine is one of the world leading supplier of the grain and related food products. We are number one for the sunflower oil and in top 3, top 5 for such kind of goods like wheat, barley, corn, etc. So existence of Ukrainian food at the world market can allow to receive a balance, food balance in the world. This is the aim of the Black Sea Grain Initiative, and unfortunately, you're right that since the end of October, the Black Sea Grain Initiative works for the 30% maximum for the capacity of all 3 ports. Because according to the initiative, each vessel entered to the Black Sea or which proceed outside from the Black Sea should be inspected by the whole 4 parties of the initiative: Ukraine, United Nations, Turkey, and Russian Federation. Since end of October, Russian Federation decreased the number of inspection teams which inspect the vessels. Due to this reason, unfortunately, since November, we average have 3 vessels inspected daily for inbound movement and the same number for the outbound.
What does this say then for the prospects of the renewal of this deal?
The next date of renewal is 18th of March. We already started negotiation between UN, Turkey, and our partners in order to receive the prior understanding that the initiative will be prolonged, because agricultural industry should know before and plan the harvest contracts, etc., etc. So for the moment, we are waiting from our partners and from UN and Turkey their vision and their feedback and their position, how they see and on which condition it will be prolonged, because our expectation, not only prolonged initiative, but increased number of inspections and make a term of initiative, not 120 days, but minimum 1 year. Because, again, the market should understand and plan activity for the long period, not only for months.
And let's talk about the impact, not just on the vessels that are trying to get grain out to the wider world, but the impact of the war on the commercial shipping industry, maritime operations in general. What impact has it had on that?
I would like to remind that since the beginning of the war, Russia announced the area around our ports like a war zone, like a counter-terrorist area, and warned the vessels, civil vessels, they can also be attacked in case of the movement. It was few accidents with the civil vessels, and after that the navigation were stopped. We would like, and we are drawing attention that this is violation of the international convention in the field of the maritime commercial shipping. We are not talking about military shipping. And we applied to the International Maritime Organization, to United Nations, in order to renew the free shipping in the Black Sea. This is the right of Ukraine, like independent country.
Yuri, good to talk to you. Many thanks indeed for being with us
Thank
today.
you.
That was Yuri Vaskov, the Deputy Minister of Infrastructure. Let's get back to Doha now. Doreen has more on how the loss of Ukrainian grain has caused a global food crisis.
Indeed, Adrian, yes, I do. So from wheat to vegetable oil, Ukraine and Russia are agricultural powerhouses and they're major exporters to the world. And the war has had major consequences for food and fertilizer prices. It disrupted export flows and helped fuel some of the sky-high inflation we've seen this past year. So let's look at the price of bread, for example. In 2022, the EU saw the cost of a loaf soar 18%, but that doesn't really tell the whole story. Eastern European countries were much more reliant on Russian imports. Bread prices went up more than 30% in Lithuania and Estonia, and a massive 66% in Hungary. And bread is heavily subsidized in many parts of the Middle East and North Africa. In Egypt, subsidized bread for the poor has been kept cheap, but local media reports that the price of unsubsidized loaves has increased by 50%. And in Africa, countries reliant on imports were particularly vulnerable. Nigeria saw bread take a hike of more than 30%, and in Rwanda, it was up over 40%. But the continent's worst victim of inflation was Ghana. Official figures show cereal products like bread jumping more than 70%. Well, farmers in Ghana say they're struggling to make a living. In the country's agricultural hub, they're finding it hard to access chemical fertilizers from Russia. Victoria Gatenby reports.
Jonathan Otu's once profitable farm in the central region in Ghana is now running at a loss. He says the high price of chemical fertilizers is to blame.
In this, our area here, a lot of people didn't apply fertilizer because they don't have money to apply the fertilizer because of the cost. They couldn't afford it. And now, because of climate change, we have to get into smart agriculture. And this smart agriculture goes with those things. And if they are not available, how can you grow and make profit?
Manufacturing chemical fertilizers such as nitrogen, phosphorus and potassium needs a lot of energy. Since economies reopened after COVID-19 lockdowns, gas and electricity prices have soared. That's pushed up production costs, and some fertilizer manufacturers in China and Europe have shut down. And since Russia invaded Ukraine, energy prices have risen further. The UN says global fertilizer prices have increased by 199% since 2020. Ghana bought $40 million of chemical fertilizer from Russia in 2021. That's 40% of its annual imports. But last year, many of its farmers couldn't afford the higher prices, so went without.
Because of the war, there was shortage of fertilizer. The importers couldn't even import the quantities required. So very limited came into the market. And whatever came into the market was at a high price that was beyond the reach of most farmers.
Fertilizer provides the nutrients needed to help crops grow. Without it last year, farmers in Ghana reported lower than average yields of staple crops such as maize.
If you look at Ghana, on average, if you apply the right quantities of fertilizer on maize farm, you are likely to get between 18 to 20 bucks. With our fertilizer, most of our members, the peasant farmers, most were even getting 2 bucks, 3 bucks. So that tells you the extent of the impact on their activities.
That's bad news for a country where agriculture accounts for 21% of its GDP and more than 40% of its export earnings. Ghana is more than 5,000 kilometres from Ukraine, but farmers here say they're feeling its effects all the same. Victoria Gatenby, Al Jazeera.
Also affected by expensive fertilizers are farmers in Sudan. Hibba Morgan has more from Jazeera State in East Central Sudan.
This wheat farm in Sudan's Jazeera State is Abu Bakr Muawiya's main source of income. Every year, he sells hundreds of sacks harvested from here. But he says last year's harvests was not profitable because of a shortage of fertilizers. It was the result of sanctions being imposed on Russia, which was a major exporter of fertilizer before its invasion of Ukraine.
There was a shortage of fertilizer in the market last year, and it was expensive for farmers. When the cost of input is high, the output is low. Instead of using 12 sacks for 4 acres, we used only 6. This year, it was still costly when we started farming, so you can see some yellow on the wheat plant.
Abu Bakr is just one of many farmers in Sudan affected by the crisis. The sanctions have led to an increase in the cost of fertilizers around the world, reaching up to 100% in Sudan, according to the World Food Programme. One sack of fertilizer went from about $40 to nearly $100. That resulted in a 35% drop in harvest last year.
Fertilizers are vital for growing wheat and other grains here. Because of supply shortages, productivity has reduced, and that has reduced our self-sufficiency and increased our need for imports. And the country is facing an economic crisis, so that has put us under strain.
Export of fertilizers from Russia was cleared in October, but it was not affordable to many farmers here, contributing to less food production. And an estimated third of Sudan's 43 million people don't have enough to eat. Some farmers with large agricultural lands have been able to grow crops despite the high costs of fertilizers. Others are relying on aid organizations to help them produce better harvests. But the effect of the fertilizer shortage and the high costs when they became available has had a worse impact on smallhold farmers. Hassan Siraj is one of them. He says he was not able to farm last year because of the shortage, and he says he can't farm this year either.
This farm, for example, needs 24 sacks. 24 sacks would cost nearly $1,000. Where do I get that from? I can't. If I farm, I'll have to just farm on 2 acres to be able to afford fertilizers, and that's not profitable.
Abu Bakr says if his crops fail this year, he'll sustain more financial losses. And topped with losses from the year before, his livelihood will be at serious risk. Hiba Morgan, Al Jazeera, Jazeera State.
Frederica Greb is an economist with the World Food Programme, and she explains why lower access to fertilizers reduces the availability of food.
If we look at where fertilizer prices have come down also over the past month, but if we look at where we are now in terms of fertilizer prices versus where we were before the COVID pandemic, we are still more than 200% higher. So that and higher prices always mean lower access. So it's not as farmers cannot as easily afford fertilizer as before, and the lower use of fertilizer means lower yields and lower availability of food in the end. And one thing that you should keep in mind is also that food prices have risen sharply. For farmers, what is really important is the ratio between the price increase in food prices versus fertilizer prices. So what they get when they sell their produce versus what they need to invest in to produce. And fertilizer prices have risen much more sharply than food prices. So that then puts farmers in a difficult spot. And in the end, that's a longer term implication then that plays out over the coming harvests and farming seasons.
Well, Senegal's government is encouraging bread makers to use local grains to keep costs low and the bread affordable. Nicholas Hack reports from Fenayi in northern Senegal.
Straight out of the oven, a batch of freshly baked bread.
Wow!
When Russia invaded Ukraine a year ago, bread maker Mustafa Sal smelt trouble. Because war-torn Ukraine is the biggest exporter of wheat to Africa.
This is excellent. This is what we're looking for.
Sal wasn't going to let the shortage of the grain stop him from making the best possible loaf.
Great wheat makes great bread. This is wheat that has been cultivated and harvested here in Senegal. That's 100% local. As you can already see, we find a lot more nutrition, better quality. It's much of a better bread because of the wheat being grown locally.
This is Sal's ancestral land in the Sahel region where agronomists planted an experimental variety of wheat that can withstand desert temperatures.
It's incredible because at 46 degrees Celsius, wheat is growing here. It's a miracle, and thanks to the crisis, everyone's interested in our research, and we have no more stocks of grains to give out.
Samples of the grain are being kept in a safe house.
So scientists call this a seed bank, and inside these plastic cups are a variety of wheats from across the world, from Ukraine, Syria, to Mexico. Scientists will grow them here in these conditions because since Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the shortage of wheat have governments in the region fearful of social tension.
Most African countries continue to rely on wheat imports, and food prices have shot up after the war. The UN says 220 million people face hunger, with bread becoming unaffordable to many.
So it's to reveal the fragility of our countries and the geopolitics of hunger. There is enough wheat on the market because it's opaque, information is lacking, and some countries are constantly depending on this market. Now there is a shock.
Replacing Ukraine's wheat by local grains like moringa, millet, or local wheat is not just a temporary solution, but a gradual change in the way Senegalese consume baked goods. A desperate attempt in the face of a war on another continent, affecting millions of people across Africa. Nicholas Hawk, Al Jazeera, Fanai, northern Senegal.
And some countries are looking to cash in from the global supply shortages, and that includes wheat growers in the U.S. But uncertainty remains, as John Hendren reports from Gypsum in Kansas.
Every farmer is one part gambler. When Justin Knopf digs into the Kansas soil, as his family has for 5 generations, he's betting the rain and root conditions will allow his winter wheat crop to prosper.
See if we have good moisture around those roots.
These days, he's also taking the war in Ukraine into consideration. It's part of the reason he's planting 5% more wheat than last year.
It's increased the volatility, and it's also, I think, made me more mindful as a U.S. farmer how important our food supply is, both domestically and to the rest of the world.
He's not alone. With U.S. wheat selling for a record high average of $9.10 a bushel, a survey by Farm Futures magazine found growers across the American wheat belt have increased production by 17% over the last year. The soil here in Kansas, like the soil in Ukraine, is ideal for growing wheat. And the war being waged halfway around the world is affecting what farmers here plant and how much. The war between Russia and Ukraine, 2 of the world's largest grain exporters, has disrupted global production, forcing Ukrainians to demine their fields before harvest and cutting exports at embattled Black Sea ports. In Kansas, where the industry's wheat lab studies the most resilient and tasty strains, that conflict has combined with a U.S. drought, inflation, and pandemic-era kinks in the global supply chain to make wheat farming more unpredictable than ever.
Because of the uncertainty with the drought, what we saw, how the market reacted on the initial invasion of Ukraine, coming up on the year anniversary of that, the unknowns and the uncertainties still exist and maybe exist even more.
The impact of that uncertainty is likely to stretch from the farm to the kitchen. For Justin Knopf, there's also what he calls a moral obligation to produce more of a crop the world depends on, as less comes from the breadbasket of Eastern Europe.
We think about our fellow farmers in Ukraine and the hardships that they are going to. I can't imagine trying to grow a crop with that much conflict and upheaval around you.
With limited time till the summer harvest, that makes his gamble on winter wheat more crucial this year than ever. John Hendren, Al Jazeera, Gypsum, Kansas.
Russia had its biggest ever wheat harvest in 2022 and has been selling grain at a discount. But living costs have been rising for months. And as Ali Hashim reports, more tough times are expected with the ruble weakening against the dollar.
War, sanctions, and the global economic downturn are reducing what Dasha can put in her shopping basket to feed her family.
We began to focus more on essential products due to the fact that prices have risen. We buy what we need, no extras, because the priorities are already too expensive. For example, we now eat less fish than before.
People in Moscow are paying more for less. Dasha can only afford cheaper goods.
In general, the cost of the food basket has increased by 30%. We're spending more of our budget on groceries than before because wages have remained the same and food prices have risen.
Western sanctions imposed on Russia have led to major international brands pulling out of the country. Local companies are trying to fill the gap. Last year it was possible to fill this basket with more goods for less money. That's not the case anymore after nearly a year of what Russia calls its special operation in Ukraine. Experts are saying the government is trying to control prices, but that doesn't seem to be working. Although property rental prices have fallen in the last year, utility bills have increased by 9%, according to official numbers. Big data expert Sergei Trotyansky says people are only buying what they need.
Unfortunately, the rise in prices for essential goods is faster than any increase in people's income. But people are adapting to the difficult situation. They're reducing expenses not related to essential goods.
Sergei says inflation has reached nearly 12% in the last year, but bread, pasta and milk prices are rising above that.
In Moscow, there is an approved minimum wage of about $280. But it's obvious that living on the minimum wage is quite problematic.
Officially, Moscow says the conflict in Ukraine is having a minimal impact on the lives of Russians. But on the ground, the reality appears very different. Ali Hashim, Al Jazeera, Moscow.
Well, that's it for me on the food crisis, but make sure you tune in on Wednesday, the same time at 11:30 GMT as well as 16:30 GMT, and also on 2:30 GMT on Thursday. My colleague Adrian Finnegan will be exploring the human impact of the war